Imagine this. You're walking down a long road, the sun blazing above, your back drenched in sweat. On your shoulders, a heavy backpack. At first, it doesn't seem unbearable, you can carry it. But step after step, mile after mile, the weight grows heavier. Inside that backpack are not just stones, but memories of betrayal, fears about the future, regrets of the past, expectations that others placed on you, and even the shiny possessions you once thought would bring happiness. Now ask yourself, how far can you walk like this? How long before the weight breaks you? Life is much like that journey. Most of us are dragging around invisible loads that no one else can see, but that we feel every single day. The pressures of work, the fear of failing, the need to be accepted, the hunger for more money, more recognition, more love, more control. We cling to these things as if our survival depends on them. Yet deep down, we know the truth. Holding on only makes us sink deeper into exhaustion. The Buddha compared this to someone holding onto a burning coal with bare hands. Out of anger or desire or fear, they grip it tightly, hoping somehow it will help them win. But in reality, the only one who gets burned is themselves. That is the essence of clinging. It promises safety but delivers suffering. Letting go, on the other hand, feels terrifying. The very thought of dropping that backpack, of loosening our grip, can stir anxiety. If I let go, what will I have left? Who will I be? What if everything falls apart? These questions echo in the minds of anyone standing at the edge of release. And yet, if you pause for a moment, you'll notice something. The fear of letting go is often worse than the actual act itself. Think back to a time when you finally walked away from something that was weighing you down. Maybe a toxic relationship, maybe a job that drained your soul, maybe just the endless scrolling on your phone late at night. Do you remember that sudden lightness? That deep breath as if your lungs could finally expand again? That is the taste of letting go. It is not loss, it is freedom. But why is it so hard? Why do we cling to what hurts us? Buddhism teaches that the root of attachment is ignorance, our mistaken belief that things are permanent, controllable, and capable of giving us lasting happiness. We see a beautiful flower, and we want to keep it forever, forgetting that its very beauty comes from its impermanence. We fall in love, and instead of cherishing the present moment, we obsess about securing it, owning it, holding on tightly, as if love were a possession and not a gift. We work tirelessly to build wealth, but instead of resting in contentment, we are haunted by the fear of losing it. It's like trying to hold water in your hands. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it slips away. And so we suffer. Letting go is not about rejecting life or denying what we feel. It's not about becoming cold, detached, or indifferent. True letting go is about seeing things as they are, fluid, ever-changing, beyond our control, and choosing not to fight against the river of reality. It is about loosening our grip so that our hands are free to receive something greater, peace. Picture again the traveler with the heavy backpack. Imagine that at some point they realize they don't actually need to carry all those stones. One by one, they take them out. Regrets about yesterday set down. Fear of tomorrow set down. Anger at a friend set down. The bag grows lighter, the steps easier, the road more beautiful. Suddenly, the same journey that once felt like a burden becomes an adventure. Isn't that what we all long for? A life where we are not crushed by the weight of things we cannot control. A life where we can breathe deeply, smile freely, and live fully. But here's the paradox. Letting go feels like giving up, when in truth it is the bravest act of all. It takes courage to loosen the grip, to admit we are not in control, to trust in the unfolding of life. The act of letting go is not weakness, it is strength. It is choosing peace over struggle, clarity over confusion, freedom over bondage. Think of the lotus flower. It blooms beautifully, not because it clings to the mud, but because it rises above it. In the same way, we don't find peace by gripping life tighter, but by releasing what drags us down. And here lies the art of peaceful living. It's not hidden in a distant monastery, nor reserved for saints or monks. It's right here in the choices we make each day. The choice to forgive instead of resent. The choice to breathe instead of panic. The choice to release instead of control. Every moment offers us a chance to let go. Sometimes it's as small as exhaling stress after a hard day. Other times it's as immense as releasing an identity we've carried for years. Each release brings us closer to the heart of freedom. So ask yourself now, what weight are you carrying? What is sitting in your backpack, pressing down on your shoulders, keeping you from walking lightly through life? Perhaps it is time, not tomorrow, not someday, but today, to consider setting it down. For in the end, letting go is not about losing anything. It's about gaining everything that truly matters. Have you ever wondered why it feels so difficult to let go, even when you know something is hurting you? We cling to the very things that weigh us down, like a child holding tightly to a broken toy, crying, bleeding from the sharp edges, yet unwilling to release it. Why? The answer lies in the nature of attachment. From the moment we're born, we're taught to hold on. The infant clings to its mother's finger. The child clutches their favorite blanket. The teenager grips tightly to approval and identity. And the adult, we hold on to careers, to relationships, to possessions, to beliefs, even to our pain. In our minds, holding on equals safety. Letting go feels like stepping into the unknown. Attachment begins with a simple illusion, the belief that if I can just keep this, I'll be happy. It could be money, success, love, reputation, or even something as subtle as the image we want others to have of us. We create stories in our heads. Once I get this, once I hold on to that, then everything will be okay. But here's the catch: nothing in this world lasts. Everything shifts, changes, evolves, decays. The Buddha called this impermanence anicca, and yet instead of flowing with it, we resist it. We grip harder. We fight the truth with all our might. It's like trying to hold on to sand. At first, it seems you can keep it in your hand, but the tighter you squeeze, the more it slips away between your fingers. Attachment doesn't protect us from loss, it guarantees it. Think of a young professional climbing the corporate ladder. At first, ambition is healthy, it fuels growth. But soon the desire turns into obsession. Every promotion becomes not enough. Every compliment fades too quickly. And no matter how much is achieved, the fear of losing it all lingers like a shadow. The success that was supposed to bring freedom instead becomes a prison. Or picture someone scrolling endlessly through social media, craving likes, shares, and approval. Each notification brings a quick burst of joy, like sugar to the brain. But it never lasts. The craving grows stronger, the anxiety sharper. Attachment here is not just to attention, but to the illusion of self-worth measured by others' opinions. Buddhism teaches that attachment is rooted in two forces: desire, tanha, and ignorance, avidya. Desire makes us chase endlessly. Ignorance blinds us to reality. Together, they create a cycle of suffering that feels impossible to escape. And yet, if we look closely, we see that attachment often masks something deeper: fear. Fear of emptiness, fear of being alone, fear of losing identity. We hold on because we're afraid of what life will be without it. A person clings to a toxic relationship not because it brings joy, but because the idea of being alone feels unbearable. A person holds on to anger not because it feels good, but because letting go feels like losing power. But here's the truth: attachment doesn't fill our emptiness, it deepens it. Like drinking salt water when thirsty, the more we consume, the thirstier we become. So why do we hold on? Because we mistake attachment for love, for stability, for happiness. We believe the story our minds tell us: without this, I am nothing. But the Buddha flipped this story on its head. He taught that true happiness arises not from clinging, but from release. When you no longer need the flower to stay fresh forever, you can enjoy its beauty fully in this very moment. When you no longer demand that a loved one be exactly as you wish, you can finally love them as they are. When you no longer measure your worth by possessions, you discover the wealth that cannot be stolen: inner peace. It is not easy to recognize our attachments. They hide behind noble disguises. Love becomes possession. Ambition becomes greed. Principles become rigid ego. Even spirituality can become another form of attachment, the attachment to being the wise one or the enlightened one. But awareness is the first step. Ask yourself, what am I afraid to lose? What do I cling to so tightly that the very thought of release terrifies me? Those answers reveal the nature of your attachments. And here lies the paradox. The more we hold on, the more fragile we become. Because life is always changing. Every attachment is a ticking clock. Sooner or later, the thing we cling to will slip away. And in that moment, we discover that the very act of holding on was the cause of our suffering all along. But don't mistake this for a call to push everything away. Letting go is not rejection. It's not running from life. It is simply loosening the grip, opening the fist, allowing things to come and go with ease. It is realizing that joy is not in possession but in presence. Picture again the child with the broken toy. Imagine the moment they finally drop it and discover they are free to play, free to move, free to smile again. That is what awaits us when we loosen the grip of attachment. The question then is not why let go, but why keep holding on? And when you begin to see the truth of attachment, another realization naturally arises. Control is only an illusion. And that brings us to the next step on this journey. We all like to believe we're in control. We plan our schedules, organize our careers, arrange our relationships, and structure our lives as if every detail were a piece on a chessboard, ready to move exactly as we wish. Control gives us a sense of power, of safety, of certainty in a world that often feels unpredictable. But look closer. How much do we really control? We can't control the weather, yet we plan weddings and vacations as if the sun will obey us. We can't control other people's choices, yet we spend sleepless nights trying to make them behave the way we want. We can't control time, yet we battle against wrinkles, against age, against the slow march of days. The truth is sobering. Control is largely an illusion. Think of a father who dreams his child will follow in his footsteps, becoming a doctor or a lawyer or inheriting the family business. From the moment the child is born, the father shapes every decision, pushing, guiding, insisting. At first it seems to work. The child complies out of love or fear, but as the years pass, cracks begin to show. The child has dreams of their own, a different path calling. The tighter the father tries to hold on, the more distant the child becomes. Eventually, the very control meant to secure the bond ends up breaking it. Isn't life like that? The more we grasp, the more it slips away. The Buddha taught that clinging to control is like trying to command the river to stop flowing. You can build dams, dig channels, raise barriers, but in the end, the water will find its way. It is in its nature to move, to change, to flow, and so is life. Yet still we try. Why? Because uncertainty terrifies us. The unknown feels like chaos. And so we plan, we predict, we manipulate, hoping to bend reality to our will. But the irony is this: the more we cling to control, the more out of control we feel. Think of the person obsessed with planning every detail of their day. One small delay, a traffic jam, a late email, a missed call, throws them into frustration. Or the partner who constantly checks on their loved one, fearing betrayal. Every unanswered text becomes a storm of anxiety. Or the executive who cannot delegate, who micromanages every task, until stress and exhaustion consume them. Control promises security but delivers exhaustion. Now, this doesn't mean we are powerless. We do have influence. We can plant seeds, but we cannot dictate the rain. We can take care of our health, but we cannot guarantee immortality. We can love deeply, but we cannot ensure how others will love us in return. The wisdom lies in recognizing the difference. In Buddhism, this wisdom is called upekkha, equanimity. It is the balance of knowing what is within our power and what is not. It's the calm acceptance that while we can steer the boat, we cannot command the wind. When we forget this truth, control becomes a prison. We spend our lives clutching at what cannot be held: youth, wealth, reputation, relationships. And every time reality shifts, as it always does, we feel betrayed. But reality did not betray us. We betrayed ourselves by believing it could be otherwise. There's a story of a monk who held a glass in his hand and said, "To me, this glass is already broken. Because it is fragile, one day it will fall or crack or shatter." And when it does, I will not suffer, because I knew from the start. Until then, I will enjoy its beauty fully. This is the wisdom of seeing through the illusion of control. Instead of demanding permanence, we embrace impermanence. Instead of clutching, we open. Instead of fearing change, we flow with it. Think of your own life. How much energy have you spent trying to control what was never yours to command? The past cannot be rewritten, the future cannot be locked in. Even the present moment shifts the instant you try to hold it still. So what remains? The only thing we can truly control, our response. Our thoughts, our words, our actions in this very breath. This is where freedom lies, not in mastering the universe, but in mastering ourselves. When we finally release the illusion of control, something miraculous happens. Peace enters. We stop fighting the current and we start floating with it. We begin to see that life is not meant to be controlled but experienced. Like a traveler on the road, we no longer drag a map that insists on one rigid path. Instead, we walk with open eyes, discovering beauty in the unexpected turns, trusting that wherever the road leads, we have the strength to continue. And when we make peace with what we cannot hold, we begin to heal the wounds we've carried from the past. The past has a way of clinging to us, doesn't it? A single harsh word spoken years ago, a betrayal from someone we trusted, a mistake we regret with all our heart. These moments can echo through time, shaping the way we see ourselves and the world. We say the past is gone, but in truth, we often carry it with us like invisible scars. Some of us replay old conversations again and again in our heads, wishing we had said something different. Some of us hold on to anger, as if by refusing to forgive, we can punish the one who hurt us. And some of us bury our pain deep down, only to find it rising again in unexpected ways, through fear, through bitterness, through silence. It's like walking with a splinter in your foot. At first, you can still move. You can even convince yourself it doesn't matter, but every step reminds you it's there. The only way to walk freely again is to stop, face the pain, and gently remove what is stuck. In Buddhism, this is the practice of acceptance. Not the acceptance of what happened as right or just, but the acceptance that it did happen, that it cannot be undone, and that holding on to the wound only makes it deeper. There is a story of two monks traveling together. They came to a river and saw a woman struggling to cross. One monk quickly lifted her onto his back, carried her across, and set her down on the other side. The two monks continued their journey in silence. Hours later, the second monk finally burst out, "Why did you carry that woman? We monks are not supposed to touch women." The first monk smiled gently and replied, "Brother, I set her down hours ago. Why are you still carrying her? How many times have we done the same? The event itself passes, but we keep carrying it in our minds, feeding it with resentment, replaying it in endless loops. And every replay keeps us chained to the pain. Healing begins when we realize that forgiveness is not about excusing someone else's actions. It's about freeing ourselves from the grip of the past. When the Buddha spoke of compassion, it wasn't just for others, it was also for ourselves. To forgive is to offer compassion to our own wounded heart, saying, "You deserve to be free. You deserve to live unburdened." But let's be honest, it's not easy. The mind resists. Anger feels powerful. Grief feels justified. Regret feels unavoidable. Part of us believes that by holding on, we maintain control. Yet the truth is, the past controls us. So how do we let go? The first step is recognition. Acknowledge the wound. Do not bury it under busyness or distraction. Sit with it, feel it. Like the splinter, you must see it clearly before it can be removed. The second step is understanding. See the impermanence of all things, even your pain. What happened is not happening now. What was said is not being said now. The person who hurt you is not the same person they were then, and neither are you. Everything has shifted. The wound only stays alive because the mind keeps feeding it. And the third step is release. This does not mean forgetting, nor pretending it never happened. It means loosening the grip of identification. It means saying, yes, this happened. Yes, it hurt me, but it does not define me. I will not let this wound be the author of my story. Think of a person who was betrayed in love. For years, they close their heart, distrusting everyone, convinced they will be hurt again. In holding on to that betrayal, they live it over and over, long after the moment has passed. But one day they realize the pain was real, but it no longer has to control them. They choose to open their heart again, not because the past was erased, but because they refuse to let it steal their future. That is the power of letting go. Acceptance does not happen in one breath. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it comes in waves. One day lightness, the next day heaviness again. And that's okay. Healing is not a straight line. It is a spiral. Every time the wound rises again, we are given another chance to meet it with gentleness, to soften a little more, to release a little further. Buddhism invites us to sit in meditation and watch our thoughts. When old memories surface, instead of pushing them away or clinging to them, we observe. We notice the story our mind is telling, and then, like clouds passing across the sky, we let it drift. This practice trains us to no longer be enslaved by the past. Ask yourself, what story am I still carrying that no longer serves me? What weight from yesterday is keeping me from walking lightly today? The past will always be part of our journey, but it does not have to be our prison. By accepting it, by forgiving, by loosening the grip, we transform wounds into wisdom. We stop being victims of what once was, and we step into the freedom of what can be. And as we release the grip of the past, we begin to see that so much of our suffering comes not only from what has been, but also from what we expect will be. And that takes us deeper into the art of letting go. If the past wounds us, the future often chains us. Not because of what will happen, but because of what we expect to happen. Expectations are like invisible contracts we write in our minds. We expect our loved ones to understand us perfectly. We expect our careers to reward us fairly. We expect life to unfold in the neat order we've planned. And when reality refuses to sign those contracts, we feel betrayed. Think about it. How many times has disappointment come not from life itself, but from the gap between your expectation and reality? A birthday forgotten, a promotion delayed, a friend who didn't call when you needed them most. The event itself is often small, but the weight of our expectation makes it feel unbearable. It's like planting a seed in the ground and demanding that it bloom into a rose by next Tuesday at 3 p.m. If it blooms later or blossoms into something different, we grow frustrated, but the seed was never under our command. There's a story of a man who loved the sunset. Every evening he would sit on a hill and watch the sky burn with color. One night, clouds covered the horizon and no light broke through. He became angry, shouting at the sky for stealing his joy. Another evening, he rushed to the hill but arrived just after the sun had disappeared. He cursed himself for being late. Then one day, sitting quietly, he realized something. The sunset was always beautiful, but it was his expectations of when, how, and in what way that blinded him. Expectations are not the same as hope. Hope is open. It whispers maybe. It allows life to surprise us. Expectation demands, it insists, it must be this way. And when it isn't, we suffer. In Buddhism, this suffering is called dukkha, the dissatisfaction that arises when reality doesn't match the script we've written in our minds. We believe people should behave a certain way, outcomes should align with our plans, and the universe should bend to our timetable. But life is not a stage play with us as the director. It is more like a river, ever-changing, beyond our control, flowing according to its own nature. So why do we cling to expectations? Because they give us the illusion of certainty. If I expect my partner to always make me happy, then I feel safe. If I expect my job to always provide security, then I feel stable. But just as in Chapter 3, control is an illusion, so too is the safety of expectation. Life will not bend simply because we wish it to. And yet, when we let go of expectation, something remarkable happens. Imagine walking into a forest without demanding which bird should sing or which flower should bloom. Suddenly, every sound, every color, every movement becomes a gift. The beauty was always there. Expectation just blinded us to it. In relationships, letting go of expectation means loving people as they are, not as we want them to be. A spouse may not express love in the way we imagined, but if we stop demanding and start seeing, we may notice their love shines in small acts of care. A child may not follow the path we envisioned, but if we loosen our grip, we might discover a different brilliance blossoming in them. Letting go of expectation doesn't mean lowering standards or becoming passive. It means replacing rigid demands with openness. It means setting intentions without clinging to outcomes. It means saying, I will give my best, but I will also embrace whatever comes. This is the freedom of the present moment. When we are not chained to how things should be, we are free to experience how things are. And often, reality, when seen without the filter of expectation, is far richer than we imagined. Think of meditation. A beginner often sits expecting peace, expecting stillness, expecting a sudden burst of enlightenment. And when the mind races, when thoughts intrude, when discomfort arises, they feel frustrated, this isn't working. But the deeper practice is letting go of expectation. Simply sitting, simply breathing, simply being. In that openness, the peace they were chasing often arrives quietly, like a bird landing when you stop trying to catch it. So ask yourself, what expectations are you carrying right now? Of others, of yourself, of life? Which of them are contracts reality never agreed to sign? When you notice them, try loosening the grip. Try replacing "it must be" with "let me see." In that shift, freedom enters, because the art of peaceful living isn't about controlling the past or scripting the future. It's about meeting this moment with openness, curiosity, and acceptance. And when we learn to do that, even the smallest joys can shine brightly. But there's another layer to this journey. For many of us, attachment doesn't just live in expectations or wounds. It lives in the things we surround ourselves with, in the possessions we gather, the endless chase for more. And that's where our path takes us next. Take a moment to look around your life. The clothes folded in your closet, the gadgets stacked on your desk, the boxes tucked away in your garage. How much of it do you really need? How much of it truly brings peace? And how much of it has quietly become another weight in your invisible backpack? We live in a world that celebrates more. More money, more possessions, more success, more experiences. From billboards to social media, the message is the same. If you just have a little more, then you'll finally be happy. And so we chase. A new phone, a bigger house, a faster car. For a brief moment it feels exciting, but soon the shine fades and the hunger returns. Like drinking salt water to quench thirst, the more we consume, the more restless we become. Buddhism teaches a radically different truth. Real wealth is not in having more, but in needing less. The word is santutthi, contentment. The Buddha said, contentment is the greatest wealth. Why? Because when you are content, nothing can make you poor. There's a story of a monk who was asked why he looked so peaceful. He replied, I am happy because I want very little, and the little I have is always enough. Contrast this with a king who, despite his riches, could not sleep at night, always fearing what he might lose. Who is truly richer, the monk with an empty bowl or the king with a heavy crown? Our modern lives are filled with clutter, not just physical but mental. The possessions we keep demand our attention. The more we own, the more we must maintain, protect, and worry about. A house twice the size often comes with twice the stress. A closet full of clothes often brings the daily thought, I have nothing to wear. But when we begin to simplify, something shifts. Imagine walking into a room that is clean, spacious, and uncluttered. Your breath deepens. Your mind feels lighter. The same is true of the heart. When we let go of excess, we make space for peace. Minimalism is not about deprivation. It's not about living with nothing. It's about choosing with clarity. It's about asking, does this object, this commitment, this pursuit truly serve my life, or does it weigh me down? Think of the joy of traveling with just a small backpack. You move freely, unburdened, ready for adventure. Now imagine carrying that same lightness into daily life. Not dragging unnecessary baggage, but carrying only what truly matters. And minimalism isn't only about possessions, it's also about simplifying desires. The Buddha pointed out that endless craving is the root of suffering. The more we crave, the more dissatisfied we become. But when we quiet that craving, even simple things, a warm cup of tea, a kind smile, a moment of stillness, shine with extraordinary beauty. A young man once asked a teacher, "What do I need to be happy?" The teacher handed him a cup of water and said, "Drink this." The young man drank. Now, the teacher asked, "What else do you need in this moment?" The man paused. He realized nothing. Happiness was already there, hidden beneath the noise of wanting more. The minimalist mind is not about counting possessions, it's about shifting perspective. It's about realizing that joy does not increase with accumulation but with appreciation. It's about living with enough and discovering that enough is a treasure greater than gold. Look at nature. A tree does not hoard. It takes only what it needs from the soil, from the sun, from the rain. And in its simplicity, it grows tall, strong, and serene. We too can live like that tree, rooted, nourished, peaceful. So ask yourself, what in your life is excess? What could you release today to make space for peace? It might be an object gathering dust. It might be a commitment draining your energy. It might be a desire that has long outlived its joy. When we strip away the unnecessary, we find what is essential. And what is essential has always been simple: love, presence, compassion, freedom. This is the paradox the modern world forgets. Less is not lack. Less is space. Less is clarity. Less is freedom. And as we free ourselves from material weight, we begin to see that letting go extends even deeper into how we relate to those we love. Love is perhaps the most beautiful gift of being human. And yet paradoxically, it is also one of the greatest sources of suffering. Why? Because so often we confuse love with possession. When we say, "You are mine," we don't realize the chains hidden in those words. We hold on tightly, not wanting the other to change, not wanting them to leave, not wanting them to be anything other than what we imagine. In that grip, love loses its breath. True love is not a cage. It is a space where both hearts are free. Think about a bird. You can lock it in a golden cage, feed it the finest seeds, polish the bars until they shine. But no matter how beautiful the cage, the bird will not sing the same song it sings in the open sky. Love is like that bird, it flourishes only in freedom. In Buddhism, there is a teaching called the Four Immeasurables: loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. Together, they describe a love that is expansive, not possessive. It is a love that wants others to be happy, not just useful to our happiness. It is a love that celebrates their freedom, even when it takes them in a direction different from our own. Consider the difference between saying, "I love you because you make me happy," and "I love you and I want you to be happy." The first is conditional, tied to our own satisfaction. The second is unconditional, rooted in genuine care. But why do we cling in relationships? Because deep down we fear loss. We fear being alone. We fear that without someone to hold, we are incomplete. Yet the Buddha reminded us all things are impermanent, people change, circumstances shift. Even the closest bond cannot escape the flow of time. This is not meant to make us despair. It is meant to deepen our love. When we recognize the impermanence of those we care for, we begin to treasure each moment with them. We stop trying to freeze them into who they were yesterday, and instead we meet them as they are today. There is a story of a Zen master who held a delicate teacup, saying, "To me, this cup is already broken. Because I know it will one day shatter, I enjoy it fully now. I drink from it, I care for it, I appreciate its beauty. And when it falls, I smile because I knew all along its nature." In the same way, when we realize our loved ones are not ours to keep forever, we love them more deeply, more gently, more fully. We stop demanding permanence and we start cherishing presence. To love without possessing is not to withdraw or be cold. It is to embrace fully while holding lightly. It is to say, "I walk with you, but I do not own your path." In relationships, this letting go shows up in small ways. Parents letting go of the expectation that their children must follow the same dreams they once had. Partners letting go of the demand that the other must always think, feel, or act exactly as they do. Friends letting go of the idea that closeness must mean constant agreement. Letting go does not weaken love, it purifies it. It turns love from a transaction into a gift, from possession into presence, from clinging into compassion. And when we practice this, something profound happens. The fear of loss begins to soften. We realize that even if circumstances change, the love we have given and received remains a part of us. Love, when free, does not die. It transforms. Think of the sun. It shines on all without demanding, "You must give me warmth in return." True love is like that sun, radiant, generous, without grasping. So ask yourself, in your relationships, where are you holding too tightly? Where are you confusing love with ownership? What would happen if, instead of clinging, you opened your hand and let love breathe? To let go in love is not to lose. It is to finally discover love's true form. And as we learn to release the grip in our relationships, we begin to see that letting go is not only about how we relate to others, but also how we relate to ourselves. Because sometimes, the heaviest weight we carry is not from outside, but from within. All along this journey, we've spoken of letting go, of wounds, of expectations, of possessions, of clinging love. But at the deepest level, there is something even greater to release. Not just things, not just people, not just stories. What remains is the final, most subtle attachment, the one we hold to ourselves. The ego. We spend a lifetime building it. We shape identities, titles, roles. I am a parent. I am successful. I am spiritual. I am someone important. These words form walls around us, giving us the illusion of solidity. But like sandcastles at the edge of the ocean, all of it is temporary. The Buddha called this the illusion of self, anatta. It is not that we don't exist. It is that the self we cling to, the one we defend so fiercely, is not as fixed as we believe. Our body changes, our mind shifts, our thoughts rise and fall like waves. Who we were yesterday is not who we are today, and who we are today is not who we will be tomorrow. And yet the ego resists. It whispers, I must last, I must be special, I must be in control, so we cling to stories of me and mine, terrified that if we loosen our grip we will disappear. But emptiness in the Buddhist sense is not a void to fear, it is a freedom to embrace. Imagine a hand tightly clenched into a fist. That is the ego, holding, grasping, insisting. Now imagine the hand opening. Nothing is lost, the space simply becomes available. In the same way, emptiness is the openness that arises when we stop clinging to a rigid self. The great Zen masters would often say, lose yourself and you will find your true self. It sounds like a riddle, but its meaning is profound. When we let go of the small self, the ego bound by fears and desires, we awaken to a vast self connected with all of life. The boundaries soften. The separation dissolves. The ocean reveals itself beneath the waves. There is a famous parable. A man pours tea into a cup but keeps pouring even when it overflows. The master tells him, your mind is like this cup, so full of yourself that nothing more can enter. Empty it and then you will taste true tea. On the spiritual path, letting go of ego is that emptying. Only then can wisdom, compassion, and peace flow in. But how do we let go of something so deeply ingrained? The answer is not in force, but in awareness. Through mindfulness, we begin to see the ego's tricks. The anger when our pride is hurt, the jealousy when someone else shines, the fear when we feel invisible. Each time we gently recognize, this is the ego speaking. And in that recognition, its grip weakens. Meditation is the practice of returning again and again to this space of openness. Thoughts arise, identities tug at us, but we watch, we breathe, we let them pass. Slowly, we discover we are not the thoughts, not the roles, not the stories. We are the awareness in which they appear and disappear. This realization is not cold detachment, it is profound liberation. When we stop obsessing over me, compassion for others blossoms naturally. When the walls of ego crumble, the heart becomes boundless. The journey from ego to emptiness is not about erasing ourselves, but about discovering that we were never separate to begin with. Just as a wave belongs to the ocean, we belong to life itself. And when the wave lets go of being just a wave, it realizes it has always been the sea. So here lies the deepest letting go, not of objects, not of others, but of the illusion of a fixed I. In this surrender there is no loss, only vastness. No emptiness, only fullness. No end, only awakening. And as we reach this point, the path of letting go begins to shine not only as a personal journey, but as a way of living in the world. A life guided by compassion, wisdom, and presence. By now, letting go may sound beautiful, even liberating. But in the quiet corners of everyday life, it isn't always easy. The question arises, how do I actually live this? How do I practice letting go, not just in theory, but in the very moments that challenge me most? The answer is found not in grand gestures, but in small, steady steps, woven into the rhythm of each day. Letting go is less about one dramatic act and more about gentle, continuous practice. Step 1. Begin with the breath. The simplest and most profound practice starts here. Each inhale, each exhale is a lesson in release. We take in what we need, we let go of what we don't. When frustration rises, pause, close your eyes, breathe deeply. Imagine exhaling the tightness, the anger, the fear. The breath reminds us nothing stays. Even emotions come and go like clouds drifting through a vast sky. Step 2. Practice the pause. When someone says something hurtful, the ego wants to react instantly. But reaction is clinging to pride, to being right, to the need for control. Instead, practice the pause. Just a few seconds of silence before speaking can be the difference between fueling conflict and allowing peace. In that space, letting go begins. Step 3. Simplify your space. Look around your home, your desk, your phone. How many things sit unused, gathering dust or draining your attention? Start small. Give away one item today that no longer serves you. Delete one file you don't need. Each act of clearing the physical is a mirror for clearing the mental. As the outer world becomes lighter, so does the inner. Step 4. Release the need to win every argument. How often do we waste energy trying to prove we are right? Notice the urge. Ask yourself, is winning worth the wait? Sometimes peace is greater than victory. Sometimes letting go of being right is the truest sign of wisdom. Step 5. Forgive again and again. Forgiveness is not a single act, it is a daily practice. The memory of hurt may return, but each time you have the chance to release it anew. Whisper to yourself, I choose not to carry this today. Forgiveness does not excuse the wrong, it frees you from the chain of bitterness. Step 6. Reframe expectations. Instead of saying, this must happen, try, let me see what happens. Begin with small things, the traffic light turning red, the delayed message, the change in plans. Notice how often expectation tries to script reality. Each time, soften into curiosity. Replace demand with openness. Step 7. Practice gratitude. Gratitude is the antidote to clinging. When you give thanks for what you already have, the endless hunger for more loses its grip. Each night, name 3 simple things you are grateful for. A meal, a smile, a breath. Slowly, the mind learns life is enough. Step 8. Be present in relationships. When with someone you love, notice the impulse to change them, fix them, or hold them to your unspoken rules. Instead, practice listening, truly listening without planning your reply. See them as they are in this moment. Presence is the purest form of love, and love without possession is letting go in action. Step 9. Surrender in meditation. Sit in silence, not to force peace, but to let thoughts come and go. Each time a thought arises, don't fight it. Don't cling to it. Simply notice, then return to the breath. Over time, this practice trains the mind to release in daily life, just as easily as it releases thoughts on the cushion. Step 10. Remember impermanence. Carry this truth like a lantern, everything changes. The joy, the sorrow, the success, the failure, none of it lasts. Instead of fearing this, let it free you. When you hold your loved ones, hold them knowing this moment is precious. When you suffer, breathe knowing this too will pass. Impermanence is not loss. It is the very condition that makes each moment valuable. Letting go daily is not about perfection. Some days you will cling tightly. Some days you will release with ease. What matters is the direction, not the speed. Each small act of release is a step toward freedom. Like a river carving stone, gentle persistence shapes the mind. Over time, you may notice the heart grows lighter. The backpack empties. Life feels less like a struggle to control and more like a dance to embrace. And as you live this practice, something shifts. Letting go no longer feels like sacrifice. It feels like coming home, home to a place of peace that was always within you. This is the invitation of the spiritual path, not to escape life, but to walk it more lightly, more freely, more fully. And now, as our journey nears its close, it's time to gather these threads, the wounds we've healed, the expectations we've softened, the possessions we've released, the ego we've surrendered, into one final reflection. A reminder of why letting go is not the end of life, but the beginning of truly living. There comes a moment in every journey when you pause, turn around, and realize how far you've walked. The path behind you was filled with burdens once carried, wounds of the past, expectations of the future, the clutter of things, the grip of ego. Each step of letting go has made your load lighter, your breath deeper, your heart freer. And now, standing here, you begin to see clearly. Letting go was never about losing. It was always about gaining. What have you gained? Not possessions, not victories, not the approval of others. You have gained peace. The kind of peace that doesn't depend on circumstances. The kind of peace that is unshaken by the storms of life. This is the art of peaceful living. It is found in the quiet strength of forgiveness, in the soft release of expectations, in the simplicity of living with enough, in the courage to love without possession, in the wisdom of loosening the ego's grip. It is found in the present moment, this moment, where life is not a memory or a plan, but a living, breathing miracle. The Buddha once said, just as a snake sheds its skin, we must shed our past again and again. Each shedding is not death, but renewal. Each letting go is a return to who we really are, spacious, compassionate, whole. And what about joy? True joy is not loud or fleeting. It does not roar like fireworks or vanish like smoke. True joy is quiet, steady, radiant, like the sunrise spilling gently across the horizon. It is the joy of a heart unburdened, the joy of a mind at rest, the joy of simply being. Imagine walking through life with open hands. Whatever comes, you receive with gratitude. Whatever goes, you release with grace. Nothing to clutch, nothing to fear, nothing to lose. In that openness, every step is freedom. This is the paradox. The more we let go, the more life gives back. Because peace is not found in holding tighter, but in loosening the grip. Not in trying to control, but in learning to flow. And so, as this journey comes to its close, perhaps the deepest lesson is this. Letting go is not the end. It is the beginning. The beginning of a life lighter, freer, more awake. The beginning of love without fear. The beginning of peace that cannot be shaken. This is the joy of letting go. This is the art of peaceful living, and it has always been within you. If these words have touched something quiet within you, take this as a gentle reminder. You are not alone on this path. Together, we are learning the art of letting go and the joy of living peacefully. If this message resonates with your heart, I invite you to subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Join this growing circle of seekers who value presence over noise, depth over distraction, and wisdom over hurry. Here, we continue to explore the timeless teachings of Buddhism, not as distant philosophy, but as living guidance for our modern lives. So, if you're ready to walk a little lighter, breathe a little deeper, and discover the freedom of letting go, stay with us. Let's walk this journey together.